Hello, viewers. Well, you join me for a very special interview. I'm delighted to have with me Bonnie Zieman, who is not just a former Jehovah's Witness, she's also a mental health professional and the author of several very helpful books for those who are exiting harmful cults, including Jehovah's Witnesses. Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you for inviting me.
So, as of now, I'm amazed at how prolific you've been over the last 2 or 3 years. And I can heartily recommend these books. So in 2015, you published Exiting the JW Cult, a healing handbook for current and former Jehovah's Witnesses. The following year, you published Fading Out of the JW Cult, a memoir. And then just this year, we've had 2 books, The Challenge to Heal After Leaving a High Control Group, and Cracking the Cult Code for Therapists, What Every Cult Victim Wants Their Therapist to Know.
So, you did that well.
So I felt it was important to get the plugs in early. So, if you could just briefly talk us through those books and what your aim is in making that material available.
Well, I didn't know for a long time, Lloyd, that there were so many people leaving the ex-JW community. I'd just gone my merry way once I left and got an education and then opened a private practice as a psychotherapist. And then just out of curiosity one day, I thought, I'll check on YouTube to see if there are any videos about Jehovah's Witnesses. And the first one that I came upon was that of Cora Latham. And then somehow then others came up on the side that I could choose from, and there you were. And so I watched, and I realized from what you said that there were so many coming out. And then I joined Facebook, which I hadn't joined because I didn't want to, as a therapist, have those sort of connections with my clients. So, and then I was astounded in the Facebook groups to see how many people were coming out and how much they were suffering. And I thought, my goodness, my whole life has kind of evolved in that I could offer some help here. So I just wrote that book.
Oh, sorry.
It was very presumptuous of me at the time.
Sorry, your audio just cut out momentarily. Hopefully, it's all good. So yeah, you basically, from what I can gather, you were out for a number of decades before you turned your hand to writing, and you were, involved in counselling and giving people that kind of help.
Yes. And my clients were not cult survivors. My clients were everyday people with problems with their relationships, problems they wanted to deal with from their past, maybe work issues, depression, so on. So I was really quite ignorant of the whole cult phenomena, although I had been in one for 30 years.
So, obviously, it's a very delicate subject to kind of broach with people. And one thing that I really admire about your books is that you recognise that, and you advocate, seeking one-on-one help with a mental professional, which I think is fantastic. I'm just wondering kind of how you prepared yourself for delving into the writing process, because it's one thing to give this one-on-one help, but another thing entirely to be, writing about it, and you go into quite a lot of detail. So talk us through the kind of research and preparation that went into that side of things.
Well, there wasn't a lot of research. I understood what it was to be in a cult, And I understood that the injuries that one comes out of a cult with are injuries of loss, of betrayal, of depression, of aloneness. And these are basically very common human themes that any psychotherapist is trained to deal with. So I just sat down and started writing using the information I had used for many years, but applying it specifically to cults. And I had my own experience in a cult to inform me during the process.
Excellent. So you mentioned your experience in the cult. It would be remiss of me not to ask you what your background is as a Jehovah's Witness and how your story roughly kind of worked out.
Well, I was a third generation Jehovah's Witness. I could say fourth because my great-grandfather, on a trip to Pennsylvania, wrote back to his daughter, my grandmother, telling her about this amazing speaker he had heard, Charles Taze Russell, and sent some pamphlets back, and I think that was the beginning of my grandmother getting involved. And my mother was just the most ardent witness that you could ever meet. But she was a happy one. Many of the witnesses, they were very dutiful and they went about doing what they had to do. My mother loved it. And she tells me about going to, when she came down from northern Ontario to Toronto and went to a big assembly they had there. She clapped after every sentence the speaker spoke, and she'd be the only one in the audience clapping, but that was just the level of her enthusiasm. And so it was, I just got swept along in all of that. But then as I got to be 8, 9, 10, I started to think some of the things I was hearing and reading just didn't make sense. But I never felt I could broach that with my mother. It would be, there were other factors. My father often disappeared from our family life, and I didn't want to hurt my mother, so I thought, speaking badly about the witnesses or asking questions would hurt her, and I didn't want to do that. And so I became a pioneer, and shortly after pioneering, when I was 17, I met my husband at a convention, and 2 years later we were married, and I was thrust into French-speaking Quebec with him and made a special pioneer because he was a special pioneer and a congregation servant, as it was called at the time. And oh my gosh, that was horrible. I did not enjoy that experience, like having to go door to door with memorized sermons in French and speak to these people, telling them their religion was wrong in my broken French. I just felt it was so insulting to them to do such a thing. So
it's not the most natural thing for anyone to have to do, is it?
No. So, but during that time, I was unhappy, and I would mention things to my husband, and he would always defend the witnesses. He was very devoted himself, and but slowly, once we had a child, and we had a child just as my husband was going for training for the circuit work. That same week, I went to the doctor and discovered I was pregnant. So it was disappointing for him, but I was breathing a huge sigh of relief because I didn't want to be a circuit overseer's wife. So then as my daughter started to get older, I thought I can't make her do all the things I've hated doing. And so I started to just back off, and then had 2 more children and just got really busy with that. Then started going to school, and I just faded out. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy on my husband. And about a year after I got out, he started to drift away. But I think he did it more for the family than for the reason that he had been awakened. I don't think he was truly awakened. And in fact, Lloyd, some of your videos, all these years later, I got him to sit down with me and watch many of them. And that was the time that I really noticed a difference, that he didn't have this sort of intellectual loyalty towards them. And he really started to see, some of their abuses, and made a difference.
Well, that's really good to hear. And please pass on my regards to him. Yeah, I guess different things are going to resonate with different people. I actually had a friend of mine who actually knew me when I was a JW. She's from the region, the area in which I grew up, and she recently contacted me, and she said, "Do you have any material or articles that you can recommend for someone who is, who hasn't been to meetings or anything for a while, but who I'm trying to kind of steer in that direction, in the direction of learning more?" And I kind of instantly knew that she was asking me not to recommend my own material, but to maybe recommend something that's softer, that's kind of really, really easygoing for someone that still has lots of hang-ups to listen to. So, again, there's people are at different in different places with their awakening. So I'm glad that your husband was able to be helped. I have a few questions for you. Now, first of all, I want to read, if I may, from your book, your quite brilliant book, Exiting the JW Cult. I'll confess I haven't read this all the way through to cover, but I do kind of use it as a reference, and whenever I turn to it, I'm never disappointed in the information inside. I did want to read one paragraph, if I may, and then ask you something. It's from page 45. Ex-JWs have experienced trauma, profound stress, in so many ways while trying to extricate themselves from the oppressive sect. The trauma can be caused by having to appear before a judicial committee to justify their actions, or by being publicly denounced and banished from the congregation, or by being cut off from their family who are advised to shun them, etc. Unfortunately, there is no formal critical incident debriefing for brave exiting JWs unless they can afford to go to a good therapist. However, if you cannot afford the cost of a therapist, you can still find ways to debrief yourself. And I thought the use of the word debrief was fantastic, because it is that sort of situation where you've been through an ordeal and you need to kind of to reason with yourself and help yourself understand what you've been through. So my question is, what advice would you have for someone who is just coming to the realization that their JW beliefs aren't true?
Well, if they can, they need to find some way to talk about it. So if they have someone else who's come out with them, or if they have relatives or friends who were never a JW. Now, you don't want to overwhelm the poor person with everything, and you've got to be judicious in terms of how you do it. But that's the way we as humans heal. You know, if something traumatic had happened, perhaps, I don't know, you were in an accident and your daughter was in the car and it was a very close call. Once everything is sorted out and you're back home again, the natural impulse is to talk about it. And this happened, and then this, and I thought we were okay, and then I never expected, and we waited for so long for the police to come, and our brain our psyche is automatically sorting things out for us just by the simple act of retelling our story, our experience. It's like a reprocessing of it and a a digesting of it, if you will. So we need to talk about it. If we have no one to talk about it with, then I would recommend that you start a journal and just start writing. And it doesn't have to be in any linear fashion. Write about whatever's present for you in the moment, whatever's kind of throbbing inside. If you are more of a linear type person and you want to write your whole experience from beginning, do that. Maybe have a section at the end where if something arises and you think how difficult it was, then just write about that experience. But it's in the retelling, the debriefing, that is critical incident debriefing is what is done after, say, it's offered for employees. Say they work in a bank. The bank is held up. Perhaps they're held hostage for a couple of hours. The first thing that the city provides usually is a team of debriefers, psychologists that will come in, and they're not doing therapy. They're there to listen. Talk about it. Tell me what happened. Tell me how you felt as that happened. But they're not going to go any further than that. But they know that that piece is huge.
That sounds like fantastic advice. I'm just thinking, and I definitely would recommend that myself, although it's always nicer to hear it from someone who knows what they're talking about. I'm just interested.
Well, that's true, Lloyd.
It's
though. A
true.
lot of us just know this
Yeah.
instinctively and even did it for ourselves without the advice of a professional.
Indeed. What do you say, though, Bonnie, and you must have heard this, I know I've heard it, to those who say, listen, I've figured out that it's not true. I've realised it doesn't make any sense. If you don't mind, I'd just rather, completely forget about all of that and not remind myself of it, and go on living my life without any reminders whatsoever of the experience that I've had. In other words, they don't want to watch any videos, read any books, review any information that kind of firmly establishes why their beliefs weren't true. They've just kind of sussed it out, and that's enough for them. What do you say to someone in that situation?
Well, I would tell them to trust their impulses. We're all different, and maybe that's the way they handle things. Maybe they need to get on with life and immerse themselves in something different, and then later on they'll come back around to it. Actually, it will come back around to them. But if they need to, at first, just get away from it. That was kind of my experience, although I didn't have a psychotherapy background at that time. But I just wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't want to read about it. I didn't want to hear about it. I wanted to rebuild a life that had been stolen from me. So I totally get that. But it doesn't go away. If you repress the stuff, it's buried in your cells, and when it feels that you're strong enough to handle it or ready to handle it, it will bubble back up, and you may think, oh, I want to do a little research now, or I want to read about how other people have handled this issue or that issue. So trust your own process.
That's interesting advice. It wasn't instinctively what I was thinking, because my approach to life in general is that if there's a problem, confront it, deal with it, get it sorted. But maybe that's a little bit too oversimplistic. Maybe, like you say, it's a case of waiting till it's the right time for you to deal with these things. Well,
your natural approach is valid for you and for many other people that are like you. But we're not all the same. We process life differently. Some of us are avid problem solvers, and others we just need to back off and have other experiences for a while.
Yeah,
and allow psyche to heal on its own in whatever way it does.
Definitely.
I would say trust your instincts and trust your own natural way of handling life. Yeah. And then see that it's not working, then you may have to rethink your approach if you are getting depressed or anxious or angry or whatever.
No, it's great advice. I guess another thing that prompted it is that I do obviously get messages from time to time from people who say things like, I've been disfellowshipped for 20, 30 years, and only now do I get it. Only now have I seen one of your videos or something, and okay, now I understand. So I guess from my perspective, although like you say, it's different for other people, it would be a shame to go for that length of time with kind of unresolved issues. I guess that's more where I'm coming from.
Some of us have better ability to suppress, so the issues wait around and will come knocking at some point. But I agree with you. If I had my druthers, it would be good to deal with it immediately upon getting out.
Absolutely. Now, another question that I need to ask you, because it's a question I get asked all the time, and one I was asked repeatedly when I recently did my tour of America and Canada, and that's, how do you... It's a question that there isn't really an answer to, but I wanted to ask you anyway.
Thanks.
How do you wake up, indoctrinated friends and relatives?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. I think that question from those people is a bit of the leftover indoctrination and patterns of being a JW, where we felt it was our right to go and knock on someone's door and tell them what you're believing isn't accurate and I'm going to help you change. It's interfering in someone's life. So, for instance, with my sister, I don't interfere in her life. She's an adult. She's making her own choices. She has access to libraries, bookstores, the internet, YouTube, whatever. She can find newspapers, she can get information. And I don't, it's my view, and I don't see it as my job to wake her up. I think that would be interfering. The wonderful child psychologist D.W. Winnicott, he's the, guru of the field for child psychologists. He said that parents shouldn't, there's two things that you should do to be a good parent. Don't interfere and don't abandon. Well, I've taken that advice and I applied it not only with my family, but as a therapist, as a friend, and so on. So don't interfere in unless someone is, really at risk of being abused or being hurt, then I would speak up and be assertive and say something. But if they're happy in their life, I'm not going to interfere. But I'm also not going to abandon. I'm going to be available. And if they ask me a question, I'm happy to respond and direct them towards information or supply the information myself. But generally, if it's a mate that's still in and you're out, well, I'd be very judicious about that. Maybe leave material around that they could pick up if they choose. They have free will. They have the right to do as they please and to go to a meeting if they please and to read the literature, just as we have the right to. We want the right to read what we please and make our choices. So not everyone sees things that way, but that's the way I see it.
I can kind of follow you with that to a degree. My only, because as you know, I've taken quite a lot of flack for saying that, it's not good to confront people and to kind of push them into a corner and call them names and that kind of thing. So I'm totally on board with that. And actually in my own situation with Deanna, it's just worked out that way anyway, where you don't help someone out of that kind of cult by kind of by pushing information in their faces. They have to want the information. That's just the way things work in everyday dialogue. You don't get someone to agree with you by forcing them to agree with you. They have to come to that realization themselves. I guess the only I would only say that, I compare in my own book Jehovah's Witnesses to North Korea, and say it's a bit like this situation in North Korea where you've got all of these people who are in a country that has become the sole ownership of a tyrant, and if we could find a way of emancipating them, we would do. But emancipating them is harder than just it's far more complicated than just going in there and saying, hey, you're all free now, because they would probably fight for their leader if or many of them would anyway.
And fight for their beliefs, even though their beliefs and patterns hurt them.
So I guess what you're saying is making sense to me, but on the other hand, I'm thinking that the predicament they're in is not pleasant. And when someone that you know and love, say a husband or wife, is in a situation that is unpleasant, you want to help get them out, And
of course.
Yeah.
Well, if they ask you something, there's an invitation, and then presenting material would not be interference.
No.
Now, in terms of what you do, for instance, I think it's a whole other ballgame when you choose to be an activist against an organization. And if during your activism against the organization, individuals are awakened or their interest is piqued and they do more research, that is great. But if you're not an activist, if you're just talking about family members, I think it would backfire anyway.
Yeah.
If you start going around trying to convince your friends and family that, they would just see you as more of an apostate, more controlled by Satan. It would just prove what they already believe about you even more.
Yeah, and frankly, whenever I have tried with my own friends and family who are indoctrinated to help them see sense, perhaps in my more naive period when I was just waking up myself. It got
enthusiastic.
I made mistakes. I freely admit that, but I think back to some of those exchanges, quite emotional exchanges, and just think there's just no way I was ever gonna get through to them with that approach,
But the wonderful thing is that now they know you're there and they know you have the information, and if something happens that makes them question or wake up, they will come to you immediately. So there's hope.
I certainly hope so. I think you can kind of understand as well with people who are so elated at having experienced freedom themselves that they want it for their relatives.
Yes.
Another thing I say to people, which I find is really the only answer, is that if there was a magic bullet for helping people out of cult indoctrination, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There would no longer be Jehovah's Witnesses. So
exactly.
So I want to actually ask you another question, which is fairly contentious, but I'm interested in your thoughts. What do you think of using the word cult?
Yes. Why do you see it as contentious? I know for a while it was quite contentious in that it was kind of pejorative, and they started to call it a religious something. Oh, I forget the word they used.
Yeah. Oh, it's not a trick question. I obviously use the word cult a lot, but I know that there are some who prefer not to use it. I personally think it's problematic to use it because it's basically subjective. You can decide for yourself essentially whether something's a cult or not. Whereas if the example I give in my book is that if someone's a criminal, well, that's an objective thing because they've been convicted in a court of law, but there's no court that determines what cults are. So that's why I
No,
find it difficult to
there
use that
are,
word.
as I point out in my latest book there, Cracking the Cult Code,
Hmm.
there are specific behaviors that
Hmm.
identify a cult. You can, and there's, the work of Robert J. Lifton and so on that identifies 8 specifics that you can see in any effort at thought reform.
Hmm.
And Jehovah's Witnesses fit all of the criteria. They practice all of the behaviors. The organization does. Now, no Jehovah's Witnesses think that they're in a cult. I certainly didn't. And even for years after being out, I never referred to it as a cult. But as I read books by Lifton and Langoni and Cialdini and so on, I realized, my goodness, this fits all the criteria of a cult, and I'm going to refer to it as such.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm unapologetic in using it, as you probably know, but I just was interested to get your take on that. So I'm going to move on to the next question, and for this I will, again, if you don't mind, I mean, hopefully I have your permission to do this, but I'm
Of
going
course.
to read from your book. Very helpful part, actually. Let me see. Yeah, here we are. This is on page 19. It does take more time and a calling up of even more internal resilience to bear being cut off from children, especially minor children. The JW shunning policy is a blatant violation of basic human rights, the fundamental right to not have the integrity of our family subjected to outside interference. This kind of injustice and familial rupture elicit profound grief, and you will find yourself in a period of extended mourning due to such treatment. I thought that was very, very poignant, and I am in complete agreement about human rights. The problem I've found, and I'm sure you found this, is that so few people make the connection of there being a human rights issue with cults
Right.
like Jehovah's Witnesses. So what do you feel can be done to raise broader awareness about this side of things?
Well, I think some activists like you and Patrick Hake are, making people aware of it, and with Patrick actually having a lawsuit against the government to help the government see that Jehovah's Witnesses interfere in the lives of families. It's difficult, It's like governments have given religions a pass to do all, unless it's sexual abuse or torture or killings, they can pretty much do whatever they like. But to tear apart a family should attract some attention and have some repercussions. So I think writing articles about it, your JW survey, written many articles about that, and what's happening with the UK Charity Commission and what happened in Australia. I mean, it just is coming more and more to the forefront, and it takes activists and speaking out. And do you have other suggestions that we can do?
No, I was just interested for your insights, and I actually think that just by writing about it, as you have done in your book, is a big help, because your book will have good circulation, and it's important to get that message across as loudly as possible. I mean,
Yes.
I know I've encountered kind of a little bit of resistance when making this argument, even from ex-JWs, because they say, well, yes, human rights are important, but it's countries that sign up to human rights, not religions. But the arguments I've made, and you'll be familiar with these arguments, is that, well, yes, that's true, but when governments extend tax exemption and even charitable status to organisations that are breaching human rights, then they're complicit in that. So,
and you would think that fundamentally you could trust when you join a group or a religion that you can trust that you are not going to be abused.
Yeah.
And that some function in the government would step up when it sees that people are being abused.
Yeah, that's what the government's there for, isn't it? To protect its citizens. So,
but as you say, I think there's real value in naming things for what they are. If one of us takes the opportunity to name it and 30 people read that and then they mention it to someone else, the idea spreads. The idea is contagious, and people might not have thought of it in those terms before, and they go, oh my goodness, yes, it is a human rights violation.
Exactly. So again, I appreciated you mentioning that, and I know it's a point that you make a couple of times in that particular book. I'm going to let you off the hook soon, but I did want to, on that last question, kind of a related question. Your latest book is, or one of your latest books is titled Cracking the Cult Code for Therapists, What Every Cult Victim Wants Their Therapist to Know. Are you hopeful that there can be better engagement and exchanging of knowledge between therapists and cult survivors and activists?
Oh, absolutely. And I think as therapists realize that this is a growing client population for them, as they're streaming out of many cults right now and looking for mental health professionals, that they're going to be motivated to inform themselves. But it's one of the biggest complaints that I see in the JW recovery groups, that they go to a therapist and the therapist says, well, that's great, you got out, and they know nothing about it. They don't understand at all how their development was repressed by being in a cult, how their freedoms were forfeited, the controls on their thinking and behaviors, and even their sexuality. So no, I am hopeful, and that's why I wrote the book, is hoping that either they would find it, the therapists themselves, or clients could bring it to their therapists or recommend that they read it to inform themselves, to get a basic grasp of what people go through in a cult, and more importantly, the psychological effects of getting out that they're left with.
If there is someone watching this who has got out of a cult, doesn't have to be Jehovah's Witnesses, and
right.
and they're thinking, well, I need help. I just know that I can't cope with this, and I do need a therapist, but I'm reticent about getting involved in therapy, given the fact that so few therapists seem to be aware of cults. What would be your advice to them?
Well, as I mentioned in one of your first questions, it would be nice if therapists really understood what happened to you in a cult. They may not, but they do understand how to help you manage loss, manage grief, manage your very justifiable anger, manage depression and anxiety. So trust that they can help you with those issues. You may have to spend a little time sharing with them the source of those issues, but hopefully not too much. And then you can get on to just dealing with the issue. And the therapists know how to do that.
That's good
advice. It doesn't matter where the loss comes from. If you're dealing with loss, if you're grieving, any good therapist can help you with that process.
Yeah, I mean, it would be ideal if they knew about cults, but like you say,
Right.
they're still going to be equipped if they're a good therapist to deal with,
Yes.
those issues. So, yeah, excellent. Well, Bonnie, I'm very delighted that you could join me for this conversation. I like to think that this isn't the last time you'll be on my channel, because I'm sure that there's a lot more insights that you have that my viewers will benefit from. But for now, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you, Lloyd. I enjoyed it.
Okay, so hope you enjoyed that, viewers. Stay tuned with the John Cedars channel for similar interviews in the future. And as always, thank you for watching.